At 19 years old, Eliza Vane had no home, no family left to defend her, and no work in a town where winter had already begun closing its fist. Caldwell Mercer, owner of the last operating fish company in Grayhaven, cast her out after she refused to falsify wage records that would have cheated 30 cannery families of money they had earned. And when she stepped into the rain that evening, she carried only $4.70 in a flour sack tied beneath her coat. 3 days later, she spent $4 of it at a county tax sale on the boarded Alder Street Cannery, a rotting waterfront ruin in a dying Oregon town where people had already begun tearing empty houses apart for firewood. They told her she would starve inside it. They called the purchase foolish, desperate, and almost comical. Yet behind a false wall in the cannery office lay a bundle of letters, sealed against salt and time. Letters that would not only change Eliza's life, but uncover what had been stolen from Grayhaven and give its people a way to rebuild what greed had nearly erased. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eliza Vane. If you are watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments, because forgotten places often carry the longest memories. Grayhaven stood where the Alder River widened into a cold gray bay before surrendering itself to the Pacific, and in the year 1898, it was a town built from timber, fish, rain, and promises that had once seemed impossible to exhaust. Fir-covered hills rose behind it, dark and steep, while the waterfront stretched along mud flats and pilings crowded with canneries, smokehouses, net lofts, warehouses, and narrow boardwalks that trembled beneath every wagon wheel. In spring, salmon returned in such numbers that the river seemed to move backward. In summer, steam whistles sounded before dawn, calling men, women, and children into long wooden buildings where fish were cleaned, cut, packed into tin, cooked in iron retorts, boxed, and shipped by rail and coastal steamer to cities most workers would never see. Eliza had been born in a room above Vane's General Supply, a small store her father kept near the east end of Wharf Street. Her father, Samuel Vane, sold lamp oil, flour, nails, sailcloth, stove parts, coffee, salt, medicine, and nearly anything else Grayhaven required between steamer arrivals. He was not wealthy, but he possessed a gift that made him trusted. He remembered what every household could afford. If a fisherman's wife needed flour before payday, Samuel wrote the amount in a narrow brown ledger and never mentioned it in front of others. If an old logger came in 3 cents short for tobacco, Samuel pretended he had counted wrong. If a child arrived with 1 coin and a list too long for it, he found a way to fill the sack without making charity visible. Pride keeps some people standing when food cannot, he once told Eliza. Never knock away the thing holding a person upright. Her mother, Martha, managed the store's books and kept them with greater precision than any bank clerk in the county. She had grown up near Astoria, the daughter of a sailmaker, and she believed every transaction carried a story, larger than its numbers. Behind each unpaid account was illness, a broken boat, a weak fishing season, a funeral, a birth, or a winter that had lasted too long. Martha taught Eliza to read columns before novels. At 8, Eliza could add a page of figures without moving her lips. At 10, she could tell when an invoice had been altered because the ink dried differently in the changed line. At 12, she discovered a freight company had charged Grayhaven merchants twice for one shipment of coal oil, and her father recovered. Enough money to keep 3 families warm through February. She also learned to repair things. Samuel disliked throwing away any object that still held usefulness. He showed her how to clean rust from hinges, patch torn canvas, reset a loose chair joint, replace the leather cup in a hand pump, and straighten a bent stove pipe with a mallet and patience. The store's back room became her schoolhouse. Broken crates became shelves. Empty tins became measuring scoops. Splintered boards became kindling or patches, depending on their grain. Most things tell you what they can still become, Samuel said. You only have to look longer than the person who discarded them. That lesson entered Eliza so deeply that she could not pass a broken object without studying it. She saw possibility in warped wood, cracked glass, worn rope, and tools missing handles. Later, when people said the Alder Street Cannery was dead, they did not understand that Eliza had spent her whole childhood learning that ruin was often only a condition, not a verdict. The Vane family lived modestly above the store. Their kitchen windows faced the bay, where Eliza watched masts move through fog and gulls fight over fish heads along the docks. She knew the working rhythm of Grayhaven by sound. The first whistle belonged to the North Shore Cannery. The second came from Bell and Mercer Packing. The Alder Street Cannery used a deeper steam horn that rolled across town like distant thunder. In those years, Alder Street was the pride of the waterfront. It had been built by Jonah Bell, a broad-shouldered man with a quiet voice and one damaged hand. Unlike many owners, Jonah had worked inside canneries before owning one. He knew the cold of cutting tables, the sting of brine and cracked skin, and the exhaustion of 12-hour shifts beside steaming machinery. His cannery employed immigrant families from China, Norway, Finland, Mexico, and coastal tribes whose fishing knowledge long predated the town's existence. He paid by posted rates, maintained a common kitchen during peak season, and allowed widows to work shorter shifts without losing their place. Grayhaven respected him, though wealthy businessmen considered him too generous. Jonah Bell often came into Vane's store for packing twine, ledger paper, or coffee. He spoke to Eliza as though her questions deserved answers. Once, when she was 11, he brought her through the cannery during a Sunday shutdown and showed her the machines at rest. The building seemed enormous. Conveyors ran through it like wooden rivers. Iron retorts stood along the rear wall, tin cutting. Presses waited beneath skylights filmed with salt. Racks of labels rose near the packing tables. The air smelled of oil, smoke, fish, and wet lumber. Jonah showed her how the process depended on order. A cannery can waste a fortune in one badly planned hour, he said. But with careful hands, even scraps feed someone. He pointed toward barrels where fish waste was collected for fertilizer and oil. Nothing should be thrown away merely because the richest buyer has no use for it. Eliza remembered those words. Then Caldwell Mercer arrived in Grayhaven. He came first as Jonah Bell's partner, bringing Eastern money, rail connections, and promises of expansion. Mercer was 40 at the time, tall, polished, and always dressed more carefully than the weather required. His boots remained clean in streets where everyone else's sank into mud. He spoke of efficiency, markets, volume, and consolidation. To many in Grayhaven, he seemed like the future. Jonah Bell saw opportunity in him. Samuel Vane saw danger. Mercer watches people the way merchants watch scales, Samuel said one evening. He is always calculating how much pressure they can bear before they break. Within 3 years, Bell and Mercer Packing absorbed 2 smaller smokehouses and purchased fishing rights along a wide stretch of the Alder River. Mercer arranged contracts with boat owners, then advanced them gear and supplies against future catches. The terms looked fair until a poor season came. Then interest accumulated. Boats changed hands. Men who had once fished independently became workers on vessels they had previously owned. Jonah objected to the harshest agreements, but his objections began to carry less weight. Mercer controlled the loans. Mercer knew the railroad men. Mercer had friends in the county office. The partnership soured quietly. No public quarrel occurred. Instead, Jonah Bell appeared less often on the waterfront. His signature vanished from posted notices. Workers began receiving wages late. The common kitchen closed. Shift lengths increased. Then, during the winter of 1892, Jonah died after falling from a warehouse staircase. The town called it an accident. Some believed it. Samuel did not. He attended the funeral, returned home in the rain, and placed a sealed envelope inside the store. Safe. Eliza saw him do it. "Whose letter is that?" she asked. "Something Jonah wanted kept until the proper time." "When is the proper time?" Samuel looked toward the window, where Bell and Mercer's steam whistles sounded across the dark bay. "When truth has enough company to survive being spoken." Eliza did not understand then. Later, she would think of those words until they became almost a prayer. After Jonah's death, Mercer renamed the company Mercer Coastal Packing and closed the Alder Street Cannery, claiming its machinery was outdated. He moved operations to the newer North Pier plant, where workers could be supervised more tightly. The old building was boarded, its boiler drained, its windows covered, and its deep horn silenced. Without the cannery, Alder Street began to die. Boarding houses emptied. A bakery closed. Net menders lost work. Family moved north toward logging camps or south toward larger ports. Shops along the eastern waterfront struggled, including Vane's General Supply. Samuel extended more credit than he could afford. Martha warned him gently, "If every account remains open, ours will close." "I know, but you will keep doing it." He looked at the names in his ledger. "For a while." That while lasted until Samuel's health failed. Years of damp weather and long store hours had settled in his lungs. By the winter of 1895, he coughed through the night and could no longer lift flour barrels without resting. Eliza, then 16, took over deliveries, ordering, and much of the bookkeeping. Martha ran the counter. Together, they kept the store alive, though its shelves grew thinner. Mercer offered to buy the property. Samuel refused. Then their freight account was suddenly restricted. Shipments arrived late. A supplier demanded cash rather than the usual 30-day terms. County inspectors cited the store for repairs no neighboring building had been required to make. Eliza recognized pressure when she saw it. She also noticed something strange in their old ledgers. Several fishermen who owed Mercer coastal packing also held debts at the Vane store, yet payments they claimed to have made through company deductions had never reached Samuel. Mercer's office had been collecting money from workers' wages under the claim that it would settle their store accounts, but the funds had disappeared. Eliza gathered the names, amounts, and dates. Samuel read her figures at the kitchen table. This is theft. Yes. Can you prove the company withheld it? I can prove the men were charged, not that Mercer kept it. Then we need his payroll ledgers. Samuel coughed into a handkerchief and looked toward the store safe. 4. One moment, Eliza thought he might tell her about Jonah Bell's letter. Instead, he said, "Do not confront Mercer alone." Samuel died the following March. His funeral filled the small Methodist chapel because nearly every family in Grayhaven owed him some kindness that had never appeared on a bill. Fishermen stood beside shopkeepers. Cannery women brought bread. Chinese laborers from the company bunkhouse placed white flowers near the coffin. Even men who had left town returned when they heard Caldwell Mercer attended in a black coat and spoke warmly of Samuel's generosity. Eliza watched him from across the aisle and felt something cold settle inside her. After the funeral, she opened the store safe. Jonah Bell's envelope was gone. Martha insisted she had not touched it. The lock showed no damage. Only Samuel, Martha, and Eliza knew the combination, unless someone had watched Samuel open it during his final illness. They searched every drawer, shelf, and storage box. Nothing. Martha's health declined soon afterward. Grief did what years of work had not. She became tired, then feverish, then too weak to climb the stairs. Eliza cared for her above the store while trying to keep customers, creditors, and inspectors from the door. Mercer returned with another offer. This time, he offered enough to clear the freight debt and provide Martha with medical care in Portland. Eliza wanted to refuse. Martha asked her to accept. "I will not have you buried beneath this store with us," she whispered. The papers transferred the building, stock, and rear lot to Mercer Coastal Packing. Eliza read every line. The amount was less than promised because of deductions for freight penalties, inspection repairs, and disputed accounts. But Martha was too sick to wait. They never reached Portland. She died 3 days before the coastal steamer was scheduled to depart. After burial expenses and debts, Eliza had almost nothing left. Mercer allowed her to work in the company office, claiming he owed Samuel that much. She accepted because hunger leaves little room for pride. For nearly 2 years, she copied invoices, totaled fish weights, prepared wage envelopes, and watched the company grow while Grayhaven weakened. She became indispensable without becoming secure. She knew which boats landed late, which families depended on advances, which freight cars were delayed, and which accounts had been altered. She also learned that Mercer's success rested on more than harsh contracts. He charged workers for spoiled company food, deducted rent for overcrowded bunk rooms, and shifted losses from failed shipments onto fishermen who had no way to inspect the sales records. Eliza kept private notes, not accusations, facts, dates, names, amounts. She hid them beneath the lining of her satchel. In October of 1898, the salmon run came in weak. Mercer announced reduced wages, though the company's own sales contracts guaranteed higher prices than the previous year. Workers complained. He blamed freight costs. Then he instructed Eliza to prepare new wage summaries. The figures removed. 2 days of pay from every cannery worker under a category called equipment loss. What equipment was lost? Eliza asked. Mercer sat behind a broad desk that had once belonged to Jonah Bell. That does not concern you. It concerns the totals. The totals are what I say they are. There is no matching invoice. His eyes lifted slowly. Outside, the office, rain struck the windows, and machinery thundered through the building. Eliza could hear the workers below feeding fish into lines that never paused for hunger, grief, or doubt. Mercer folded his hands. You have your father's unfortunate habit of mistaking bookkeeping for morality. Bookkeeping is where morality leaves a trail. His expression changed. Not much. Enough. You will enter the deduction. No. You are employed to copy figures, not judge them. If I write it, the company can claim the record is honest. And if you do not, someone else will. Then someone else will have to carry the lie. Mercer stood. He was not a man who shouted. His anger became quieter, and that quiet made people listen. Your family survived because this company tolerated its debts. My family struggled because your company stole payments meant for our store. The room seemed to narrow. Mercer stepped around the desk. That is a serious accusation. I have the names. You have nothing. I have enough to ask. Questions. He looked at her satchel. Eliza moved one hand toward it. Mercer rang the brass bell on his desk. 2 foremen entered. Miss Vane is no longer employed here, he said. Search the desk and escort her out. One foreman opened her drawers. The other reached for the satchel. Eliza held it tightly. That is mine. Company records may be inside, Mercer said. They are not. The foreman pulled harder. The strap tore. Her note spilled across the floor. Mercer bent and picked up the first page. His face remained composed as he read, but the skin around his mouth tightened. He collected every sheet. These belong to the company. They are my handwriting. They concern company business. You cannot keep them. I can do more than keep them. He turned toward the foreman. She has removed confidential information and attempted to falsify payroll records. Eliza stared at him. You ordered the false record. Mercer ignored her. By the time she was pushed through the office door, the story had already begun changing. A clerk was told she had been dismissed for theft. A foreman repeated that she had tampered with wages. Before sundown, 3 boarding houses refused her a room because Mercer Coastal Packing owned their mortgages. She returned to the building that had once been her father's store. Mercer had converted it into a supply office. The upstairs rooms were locked. She stood beneath the awning while rain streamed from the roof and remembered her mother at the window, her father behind the counter, and the safe where Jonah Bell's missing letter had once waited. A watchman told her to leave. She walked toward the church, but the minister's wife met her at the steps with tears in her eyes. Mercer had warned that anyone sheltering Eliza might lose company business or credit. I am sorry, the woman whispered. Eliza believed her. That made it hurt more. For 3 nights, she slept in a net shed near the bay. She ate one heel of bread, 2 apples, and a cup of broth. Teresa Lang, an elderly cannery worker, left beneath an overturned crate. Her shoes remained damp. Her hands shook from cold. She counted her money beneath the dim light of a whale oil lamp. $4.70, that was all. On the fourth morning, she saw the county sale notice nailed outside the courthouse. Several abandoned properties would be sold for unpaid taxes. A burned warehouse, 2 marsh lots, a collapsed stable, and the boarded Alder Street Cannery, including the main processing floor, office, boiler room, dock pilings, and whatever machinery remained inside. Minimum bid, $4. The notice warned that the structure was unsafe, the roof damaged, the dock condemned, and the property burdened by years of unpaid assessments. No sane buyer would want it. Behind her, 2 fishermen read the notice and laughed. "You'll starve in there," one said, when Eliza asked the clerk whether the $4 price was real. The other looked toward the old cannery, its roof line. "Dark against the bay, starve, freeze, or get buried when the place comes down." Eliza touched the torn strap of her satchel. The cannery had belonged to Jonah Bell. His letter had vanished from her father's safe, and most things, Samuel had taught her, told you what they could still become if you looked longer than the person who discarded them. She returned to the courthouse the next morning with $4 in her palm. She laid the 4 worn silver dollars upon the county clerk's table with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. The room smelled of damp wool coats, wet boots, and old paper, and several men paused their conversations long enough to watch what they assumed would become another sad mistake. The clerk, Amos Ridley, peered over his spectacles, glanced toward the boarded windows of the Alder Street Cannery visible across the harbor, and then back at the young woman standing before him. "You understand," he said gently, "that this property hasn't produced a single can of salmon in nearly 7 years. I understand. The roof leaks. I understand. The boilers were stripped. I understand. The dock isn't safe. I understand." He hesitated one last time. "You truly intend to live there?" Eliza looked through the courthouse window toward the silent waterfront. "I intend to begin there." The clerk nodded slowly, wrote her name across the transfer document, accepted the $4, and slid the weathered brass key across the counter. The key was larger than she expected, cold, heavy. It felt less like ownership than responsibility. Outside, word traveled through Grayhaven faster than the tide. By noon, nearly everyone knew. Samuel Vane's daughter had bought the dead cannery. Some pitied her, some laughed. Others simply shook their heads, believing hunger had finally driven reason from the last member of a respectable family. Old Teresa Lang found Eliza walking toward Alder Street, carrying nothing more than her satchel, 1 blanket, and a loaf of yesterday's bread. "You really did it." "I did." Teresa looked toward the abandoned building. If walls could pity people, that place would be crying. Eliza smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it has waited long enough." The Alder Street Cannery stood alone at the eastern edge of the harbor, where the river first widened toward the sea. Even abandoned, it possessed dignity. Its enormous cedar walls had weathered to silver gray beneath decades of salt air. Broken skylights stared upward like blind eyes. Rust stained the corrugated roof where rain had found its way inside. seagrass pushed between warped dock planks. The company's sign had long ago fallen away, leaving only lighter wood where the letters once hung. A cracked whistle tower leaned over the roof. No smoke had risen from its stack since Jonah Bell's death. Eliza unlocked the front door. The hinges groaned loudly enough to send gulls lifting from the pilings. Cold air drifted outward, carrying familiar scents buried beneath years of dust. Fish oil, old cedar, machine grease, salt. She stepped inside. The silence surprised her most. Buildings that once held hundreds of workers seemed unwilling to accept emptiness. Every footstep echoed through the enormous processing hall. Light spilled through broken skylights and narrow golden columns where floating dust drifted like tiny spirits suspended in still water. Conveyor frames remained. Packing tables waited where workers had once stood shoulder to shoulder. Rust-covered machines that had fed thousands. Wooden barrels leaned against walls. Broken crates lay scattered across warped flooring. Everything looked abandoned in a hurry, not carefully dismantled. Left, as though work had simply stopped one afternoon. Eliza removed her gloves. She rested one hand upon the nearest cutting table. Its surface still bore thousands of shallow knife marks. She imagined generations of workers laughing despite exhaustion. Children carrying lunches, steam rising from kettles. Jonah Bell walking these aisles, greeting everyone by name. The building did not feel dead. It felt interrupted. She spent the first afternoon opening windows that had not moved in years. Several refused. Others shattered. She swept one room clean enough for sleeping. The office still contained a large oak desk, filing cabinets with broken drawers, and shelves stripped nearly bare. Mercer had removed anything valuable, or so he believed. Eliza remembered her father's words. People searching for treasure usually overlooked usefulness. She began looking not for valuables, but for patterns. Dust revealed stories. The office floor contained faint scratches where something heavy had once stood. The bookshelves held lighter patches showing missing ledgers. One corner collected less dust than surrounding boards. Someone had visited after abandonment, not recently, years ago. She crouched beside the wall. The board sounded different beneath her knuckles. Hollow. She smiled to herself, not because she had found anything, because she had found a question. Questions were often worth more than answers. The first night proved colder than expected. Rain drummed steadily across damaged roofing. Wind moved through broken windows with long, mournful whistles. She lit a small fire inside an old cast-iron stove someone had overlooked. Its chimney still drew well. Wrapped in blankets, eating dry bread beside flickering firelight, she listened to the building settling around her. Every beam creaked, every loose board complained, yet none of the sounds frightened her. Large wooden buildings always spoke after dark. Her father used to say old structures remembered weather. Near midnight, something else reached her ears. Not inside, outside. Footsteps, slow, careful. She extinguished the lantern. Silence returned. Then another sound, metal against wood. Someone testing the front door. The lock held. A lantern moved briefly beneath the gap, then disappeared. No voice, no attempt to enter. Only someone confirming the cannery was occupied. Eliza waited nearly an hour before relighting the lamp. She slept very little. Morning revealed fresh boot prints in the mud leading away toward Mercer Coastal Packing. She measured them with her own stride, large, expensive boots. Not fishermen's. She made no comment. Instead, she began cleaning. Order reveals secrets, chaos conceals. 3 days passed. Dust became neat piles. Broken glass disappeared. One office became livable. Rain barrels collected clean water. She repaired 2 windows using salvaged lumber. While removing warped shelving, she discovered something odd. One shelf had been nailed rather than screwed into place. Unusual. Cabinet makers preferred screws. Nails suggested haste. She pried carefully. The shelf refused. She removed another. Behind it lay solid cedar wall, yet tapping produced the same hollow sound. Not an empty cavity, a narrow chamber, hidden between walls. Her pulse quickened. Who built secret spaces inside a cannery office? Certainly not ordinary bookkeepers. She searched for an opening. Nothing. No latch. No visible seam. Only cedar planks fitted almost perfectly together. She worked until sunset without success. On the 5th morning, Teresa arrived carrying soup. I figured if you're going to starve. The older woman smiled. You may as well do it with hot potatoes. Eliza laughed for the first time in weeks. Together, they shared lunch inside Jonah Bell's former office. Teresa looked around slowly. It doesn't feel abandoned anymore. It still has work left. Teresa nodded. You sound like your father. They ate quietly before Teresa noticed the removed shelving. You remodeling? I'm looking. For what? I don't know yet. Teresa stood beside the wall. She placed one wrinkled hand against cedar boards. I remember Jonah standing right here. You worked here? For 19 seasons. What was this room? Mostly bookkeeping. She paused. And letters. Letters. Jonah wrote constantly. To suppliers? Sometimes. To railroads? Sometimes. To workers? Teresa smiled. Mostly to people who needed hope. Eliza looked up. What do you mean? He wrote recommendations. For jobs? For widows? For children going east to school. He believed letters opened doors. Teresa looked thoughtfully around the office. He never threw correspondence away. Eliza's eyes returned immediately to the hidden wall. Never threw correspondence away. That evening, she examined every inch again. The hidden chamber had to open somehow. Jonah Bell valued organization. He would never destroy his own papers by sealing them permanently. She studied the shelving. The lowest board extended 1 inch farther than the others. Strange. She pushed. Nothing. Pulled. Nothing. Then she noticed worn polish around one iron bracket. It had moved many times. She lifted instead of pulling. Something clicked. The entire shelf swung outward silently. Behind it waited a narrow cedar compartment scarcely wider than a doorway. Inside sat 6 waterproof tin document boxes, perfectly preserved. Eliza stopped breathing. Every box carried a handwritten label. Correspondence, accounts, rail contracts, town improvements, private. Final. She reached toward the smallest. Private. Its lid resisted slightly before opening. Inside lay hundreds of carefully bundled letters tied with faded blue ribbon. Not scattered, organized, each bundle marked by year. The year Jonah Bell died. She lifted the earliest bundle. The paper remained astonishingly dry despite years beside the harbor. Jonah Bell's handwriting covered every page. Strong, measured, patient. The first letter surprised her completely. It was addressed not to businessmen, but to the governor of Oregon. Jonah described plans to transform Grayhaven into the state's largest independent fishing cooperative owned jointly by workers, fishermen, merchants, and local families, rather than outside investors. Eliza blinked. She turned another page, another letter, this one to a railroad president negotiating reduced freight rates for cooperative shipments. Another to engineers discussing harbor improvements. Another to investors declining Mercer because Jonah refused to surrender worker ownership. Her hands began trembling. These weren't ordinary letters. They were the blueprint for Grayhaven's future, the future Mercer had destroyed. And then, near the bottom of the first box, she found one envelope, unopened, addressed simply Samuel Vane, her father's name. In Jonah Bell's unmistakable handwriting, Eliza stared at it for a very long time. The missing letter, the one that had vanished from her father's safe. The one that had vanished from her father's safe, it had never been stolen. Jonah had hidden another copy here. She carefully broke the seal. The letter began quietly. My friend Samuel, if you are reading this, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared. My friend Samuel, if you are reading this, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared. Caldwell Mercer has not joined this company to strengthen Grayhaven. He has joined it to own the river, the boats, the labor, and eventually the town itself. I have delayed him where I could, but delay is not defeat, and I no longer trust that I will live long enough to finish what we began. The Alder Street Cannery was never intended to belong to one man. Attached to this letter, you will find copies of the original partnership articles, the worker share agreements, the harbor improvement subscriptions, and the land covenant filed when the cannery was built. Mercer believes these papers were destroyed. They were not. If anything happens to me, gather the people whose names appear in these letters. Tell them the cannery belongs, in part, to them. Tell them their wages purchased more than food and rent. Every season they worked earned shares held in trust until the cooperative could be formally declared. Most of all, do not let Mercer convince Grayhaven that its poverty is natural. A town can be made poor on purpose. It can also be made whole by purpose. Your faithful friend, Jonah Bell. Eliza read the letter twice, then a third time. The fire inside the office stove had burned low, but she did not notice the cold. She opened the box, labeled Accounts. Inside lay payroll books from every year the Alder Street Cannery had operated under Jonah Bell. Beside each worker's name was not only the wage paid, but a second column marked Cooperative Credit. Small amounts had been set aside from company profits, never deducted from wages, building ownership shares for employees, fishermen, net menders, shopkeepers, and suppliers. Her father's name appeared there. So did Teresa Lang's. So did dozens of families Mercer had driven from Grayhaven. The cannery had not merely employed them. It had been quietly becoming theirs. Eliza turned to the original partnership agreement between Jonah Bell and Caldwell Mercer. The terms were clear. Mercer's investment granted him management rights, but not the authority to dissolve the worker trust, sell cooperative assets, or move operations without approval from the trustees. The trustees were named Jonah Bell, Samuel, Vane. Martha Cho, owner of the waterfront laundry, Elias North, harbor pilot, and Chief Daniel Kittimer, representing fishing families from the lower Alder River. 3 were dead. Martha Cho had moved away. Daniel Kittimer still lived in a village beyond, the southern headland. If even one surviving trustee could confirm the documents and the worker share plan, Mercer's claim to sole ownership might collapse. Then Eliza opened the box marked Final. Its contents were darker. Copies of freight contracts showed that Mercer had deliberately redirected profitable shipments through a company he secretly owned. In Portland, charging Grayhaven excessive fees and recording the payments as unavoidable expenses. Insurance statements revealed that equipment supposedly lost in a warehouse fire had been sold months earlier. Payroll summaries showed the same invented deductions Eliza had refused to enter. At the bottom lay Jonah Bell's final letters. One was addressed to the county prosecutor. It described threats, altered books, and Mercer's effort to obtain the Alder Street property through false debt. Another was addressed to Samuel. A third was addressed to Eliza's mother. Jonah had trusted the Vanes not only because they kept accurate accounts, but because they understood the difference between debt and dependence. The last letter had never been sent. It was addressed to Caldwell Mercer. Eliza unfolded it carefully. Caldwell, you possess a dangerous misunderstanding of strength. You believe a man is powerful when others cannot refuse him. I believe a man is powerful when others need not fear him. I know what you have done with the boat contracts, the freight accounts, and the worker trust. I have copied every record. If you continue, the company you intend to steal will become the evidence that ends you. You may silence one partner. You cannot silence an entire town once it understands what belongs to it. Eliza lowered the page. Outside, dawn had begun whitening the broken windows. For nearly 7 years, Grayhaven had believed the Alder Street Cannery was an abandoned shell. Now we can understand what Eliza understood in that moment. It was not a shell. It was a locked inheritance. She did not run immediately to the courthouse. Mercer's influence reached the clerk's office, the boarding houses, the docks, and perhaps the county judge. A single young woman carrying old papers could be dismissed, robbed, or accused again. Truth needed company, just as her father had. Said she began with Teresa Lang. When Teresa arrived with another pot of soup, Eliza placed the payroll ledger on the desk and turned it toward her. Teresa stared at her own name. Beside it, over 19 seasons, the cooperative credits had accumulated into a sum larger than she had earned in any single year. "What is this?" she whispered. "Your share." "My share of what?" "The cannery." Teresa laughed once, but no amusement lived in it. "I never owned anything in my life." "Jonah Bell believed you did." Eliza gave her the letter. Teresa read slowly, moving one finger beneath each line. When she finished, she sat very still. Then she covered her mouth and wept. Not loudly, not from greed. She wept because someone had counted her work when she believed the world had forgotten it. By evening, she had brought 3 former workers. The next morning, 7 fishermen arrived. Eliza showed each person only the records concerning them, then explained the larger trust. She made copies by hand, using carbon paper salvaged from the office. Every witness signed a statement describing the years worked wages earned, and promises Jonah Bell had made. They visited Martha Cho, who now ran a laundry in Briarport. At 72, she remembered the trust clearly. Jonah feared filing the full list too early. She said, Mercer had friends in Salem. We agreed to hold the shares privately until the cannery's debts were cleared. Were they cleared? Eliza asked. 3 months before Jonah died. Martha opened an old trunk and removed a trustee seal wrapped in linen. I wondered whether anyone would ever come. She pressed the seal into wax beneath her sworn statement. Then Eliza traveled with Elias North's son to the Kittima village. Chief Daniel was nearly blind, but his memory remained exact. He described meetings in Jonah's office, the promise to preserve traditional fishing access, and the plan to create a town-owned cold storage facility so fishermen would no longer be forced to sell catches immediately at Mercer's price. He placed his thumbprint beneath a declaration. Your father came here after Jonah died, Daniel told Eliza. He said he would protect the papers. He tried. He did more than try. He kept Mercer from knowing where the copies were. Eliza thought of Samuel standing at the safe. Perhaps the missing envelope had been taken. Perhaps Samuel himself had moved it after realizing the store was watched. Either way, Jonah had prepared for loss. One copy had vanished. Another had waited in the cannery wall. Within 2 weeks, the group meeting inside Alder Street grew too large for the office. They gathered on the old processing floor beneath repaired lanterns, standing among silent conveyors and rusted presses. Families returned from neighboring camps when word reached them. A net maker from Tillamook brought letters Jonah had written, promising future shares. A widow carried her husband's payslips. A former engineer produced plans for the harbor ice house. Samuel's old customers brought ledgers showing deductions Mercer's company had collected but never delivered. Every fragment strengthened the others. Eliza organized them by name, date, and claim. She did not make speeches. She made order. Order became evidence. Evidence became courage. Mercer learned of the meetings before the month ended. He arrived at the cannery one wet afternoon with 2 foremen and Deputy Hollis, a man who had long accepted company meals, company favors, and company explanations. Eliza met them at the main door. Mercer looked past her at the workers gathered inside. You are trespassing on company property, he said. I purchased this property at a county sale. The sale was defective. The county issued a deed to an insolvent ruin burdened by company liens. Show me the liens. His jaw tightened. You stole private company documents. They were found inside a building I own. They belong to Mercer Coastal Packing. Some bear Jonah Bell's name. Others belong to the Worker Trust. No such trust exists. Teresa stepped forward, then Martha Cho, then Chief Daniel, supported by his nephew. For the first time, uncertainty moved across Mercer's face. Eliza held up the original partnership agreement. This says it does. Mercer turned to Deputy Hollis. Arrest her. The deputy did not move. On what charge? Theft. Hollis looked at the rows of townspeople. For papers found in her own wall? My company's wall. Then that seems a question for a judge. Mercer lowered his voice. You should think carefully about your position. Deputy Hollis looked toward the cannery floor. where his own sister stood holding a payroll statement bearing her late husband's name. I believe I just did. Mercer left without another word. The quiet justice began there, not with chains or public humiliation, but with the first man in Grayhaven refusing to obey him. Yet Mercer still possessed money, lawyers, and control of the operating cannery. He retaliated by dismissing workers who attended Eliza's meetings. He refused to buy fish from independent boats. He pressured merchants to deny credit to anyone supporting the trust. For several weeks, Grayhaven suffered. Families shared flour. Fishermen pooled fuel. Teresa organized a common kitchen inside Alder Street, restoring the very practice Mercer had ended. Eliza repaired the old stove system. Carpenters patched the roof with salvaged cedar. Machinists inspected the remaining equipment. They discovered Mercer had stripped less than people believed. One retort still held pressure after new valves were fitted. 2 tin presses could be restored. The labeling machine required only belts. The boiler was damaged, but not beyond repair. The building began to wake. At first, they used it only as a meeting hall and food kitchen. Then, the weak salmon run unexpectedly strengthened late in the season. Fish entered the Alder River after autumn rains, and independent boats filled their holds with catches Mercer refused to purchase. The fish would spoil within days. Eliza stood on the dock, watching silver bodies flash inside the boats. The town faced a choice. Submit to Mercer's price or reopen the cannery. We do not have capital, one fisherman said. We have fish, Teresa answered. We do not have enough tins. We have thousands in the rear warehouse, said a former packer. The boiler may fail. The engineer says it will. Hold at half pressure. We have no labels. Eliza looked toward the old shelves. Then we sell them without decoration. They worked through the night. Former employees returned to stations they had not touched in 7 years. Younger workers learned beside them. Fires were lit beneath the boiler. Belts began moving. The first press struck metal with a sound like a hammer against history. Steam rose through the roof vents. At dawn, Grayhaven saw smoke above Alder Street. People came running. The deep whistle had no working valve, so Abram Lee, the machinist, tied a wire to the release lever and pulled. The sound rolled across the bay, low, rough, alive. Workers cheered. Some cried. The first batch was small, but it was safe, clean, and properly sealed. Eliza used Jonah's rail letters to contact a distributor in Portland who remembered the old company. He agreed to buy the shipment if the cooperative documents proved valid. That proof came sooner than expected. A state examiner arrived with 2 attorneys and an investigator from Salem. Clara Webb, editor of the Grayhaven Record, had mailed copies of Jonah's letters to the governor, the Railroad Commission, and every newspaper between Portland and San Francisco. Mercer could pressure a town. He could not pressure an entire coastline at once. The investigation lasted 6 weeks. Auditors compared Jonah's books with Mercer's company accounts. They traced false freight charges, hidden sales, withheld worker credits, and fraudulent liens. They found the deductions Eliza had refused to enter and discovered that Mercer had used the same method for years. His ownership claim to Alder Street was voided. The worker trust was recognized. Mercer Coastal Packing entered receivership. The wages and cooperative credits he had withheld were ordered repaid from his remaining assets. His waterfront home, private warehouse, and controlling interest in the North Pier plant were sold to satisfy the judgment. No crowd gathered to watch him leave Grayhaven. That was perhaps the clearest measure of his fall. A man who had once controlled every conversation departed without anyone caring to speak his name. Eliza saw him only once more. He stood near the rail depot with 2 trunks at his feet, his coat immaculate despite the mud. "You believe you have won," he said. "No," Eliza answered. "The town has recovered what was already theirs. They will ruin it. Committees, workers, fishermen, none of them understand business. They understand hunger. That is not the same." "No," she said, "it is harder to forget." The train arrived. Mercer lifted one trunk, then struggled with the second. No foreman hurried to help him. No clerk carried his bags. No debtor bent beneath his glance. He boarded alone. The Alder Street Cannery reopened officially in the spring of 1899 as the Grayhaven Cooperative Packing House. Eliza refused the title of owner. She accepted the position of chief bookkeeper and operations secretary on the condition that all accounts be posted publicly each month. Every worker received understandable statements. Every contract required 2 independent signatures. A portion of profits funded repairs, another supported widows and injured fishermen, and another purchased shares back from families who wished to leave without losing everything. The cold storage plans found among Jonah's letters were finally built. The railroad honored the reduced freight agreement he had negotiated years earlier. Chief Daniel's community regained guaranteed fishing access along the lower Alder River. The common kitchen remained open during every packing season. Vane's General Supply reopened in its old building, no longer owned by Mercer. Eliza placed Samuel's original brown ledger behind the counter, not to collect forgotten debts, but to remind the town how many times kindness had kept Grayhaven alive before law finally caught up with truth. The cannery office remained much as Jonah Bell had left it. Eliza repaired the false wall, but never concealed it again. The 6 document boxes sat in a glass-fronted cabinet where every cooperative member could see them. Above the cabinet hung Jonah's unsent letter to Mercer, not as a trophy, as a warning. A town could be made poor on purpose. It could also be made whole by purpose. Years later, visitors asked Eliza why she had risked her last $4 on a building everyone believed would kill her. She often smiled before answering. She told them she had not known about the letters. She had not expected ownership shares, rail agreements, hidden accounts, or Jonah Bell's careful plan. She had known only that the building was being judged by its broken windows, just as she had been judged by an accusation, a torn satchel, and 4 coins in her hand. Her father had taught her to look longer than the person who discarded a thing. So she looked. That was all. And it was everything. At 19, Eliza Vane had been told she would starve inside the boarded cannery. She had entered with 70 cents remaining, 1 blanket, and no person powerful enough to defend her. Yet hunger did not make her cruel, and hardship did not persuade her that survival belonged only to the strongest. Behind a false wall, she found letters proving that Grayhaven's workers had built more than another man's fortune. They had built their own inheritance. Eliza could have sold the papers. She could have demanded the largest share. She could have used the evidence only to restore her family's store and secure her own comfort. Instead, she did what her parents and Jonah Bell had prepared her to do. She gave truth enough company to survive being spoken. The letters rebuilt the town because she refused to let them become merely valuable. She made them useful. She turned proof into ownership, ownership into work, and work into dignity. The cannery's whistle sounded again, not for one man's profit, but for a community that had finally learned what belonged to it. And perhaps that is why we remember Eliza Vane. Not because she bought a ruined building for $4, but because when its sealed walls opened, she understood that the greatest inheritance was not hidden paper, machinery, or money. It was the chance to return people to one another. Thank you for staying with us through Eliza's long walk from a rain-soaked street to the restored waterfront of Grayhaven. Stories like hers remind us that places, people, and promises can appear finished long before their true work is done. Share this story with someone who has ever been underestimated and tell us in the comments, what is a time you found value in something everyone else had written off? Until next time, stay close.